Welcome back to another episode of the HR Leaders Podcast, a show where we've explored the future of work with industry experts and HR executives from the world's leading global brands. Today we have a special guest on the show. We're joined by Alain Hunkins, who's a best-selling author of Cracking the Leadership Code and managing director of Hunkins Leadership Group. Welcome to the show, Alain. How are you?
I'm great, Chris. I'm really excited to be with you. Thank you for having me here today. Thanks.
I'm sorry it took so long to make this happen. It's been a while since we first chatted, and I'm glad that we're speaking now. How's everything going with the launch of the book, first and foremost?
The book launch is going really well. It released as the #1 Amazon best-selling book in the business communication category and held that spot for over 4 weeks. So that's great. And so getting great word of mouth, some great article placements, and it's just really been going well. Thanks.
Well, now more than ever, I think we need, if there's any extra practical advice and guidance in the leadership space, we could probably use it right now.
That's what I'm finding. Working with clients and talking to people is just, I like to say that, leading is always hard, but leading in a crisis is when leaders really show up, and particularly leading in a global pandemic where you can't actually lead you can't rally the troops when you can't see the troops. So the challenges have never been harder in some ways. And at the same time, I think going back to the fundamentals of what works becomes even more important. And this is really a time for leaders to be exceptionally human when they think about their approaching leadership.
Before we jump in, I've given you sort of a short intro, but give everyone a little bit more background sort of about yourself and your journey to where we are today.
Sure. Yeah. So, certainly when I was 6 and 7 years old, I didn't think about becoming I didn't even know this field of leadership consulting. Didn't even know it existed. Right. But if I went backwards, I'd have to say a common through line is I've always been fascinated by people. I guess specifically why people do what they do. And for me, that really comes out of a really fairly unusual childhood. So I was born and raised in New York City. That's not really unusual. I was raised by a single mom. That's not unusual. And my grandmother. That's not really unusual. The unusual part is that my grandmother and my mother are both Holocaust survivors. My mother's born in 1935. And so that experience, my mom was hidden from her mom for 3 years during the war. They were reunited. The rest of the family was killed. And that entire experience traumatized them, and in a lot of ways. And it definitely shaped the way they saw the world, and it shaped the way they raised me. And so early on, I had this experience of life and an organizational culture at home that was very different from my friends at school, everything else. And, humans, we love to search for meaning and trying to understand things. And I think that put me on this quest to try to understand why are certain cultures the way they are? Why do some people trust more than other people? And I continued on that quest. That was at an unconscious level. I mean, not at 7 years old. I wasn't thinking about that stuff consciously. But that continued on. I studied psychology in undergrad and dabbled in liberal arts. I actually went on and trained as a professional actor. And I went to a professional drama school for graduate school, where I got to put myself under the microscope. And being immersed in great theatrical works from all time, you get to understand psychology from the inside out, as it were. That led me into educational training and consulting, which led me to organizational training and consulting. And I've been doing that kind of work for about 25 years now. Worked with over 2,000 groups, about 42 of the Fortune 100 companies at this point.
Wow.
And so that's a really interesting journey, and certainly never planned it this way.
Yeah, I love asking that question because, everyone has their own unique story to where we are today. And it's funny how when you look back, you can connect the dots. As a 7-year-old, you definitely didn't know where you're going to be right now. And similar to where I am right now, no way. I said to you before the show, I didn't think I'd be doing this for a living as well. But when you look back, you can see the connection with the dots to where you are now. So that's pretty cool. With the new book, there's so many leadership books in this space, right? It seems like there's a new leadership book coming out every month. So what was the inspiration behind your book, and why now?
So why now for me? So as I said before, I've been working with, thousands of groups of leaders for over 20 years. And what I noticed as I was continuing to work with different leaders and different teams and organizations is I started to see these patterns emerge, right? Patterns of behavior. Both what successful leaders had certain patterns of behavior in common, and so did the mediocre ones. They were following certain patterns and falling into similar pitfalls. And so what I started doing was taking notes. And back in 2011, I started putting those notes into a blog. And those blogs over time ended up growing and growing. I committed to a consistent publishing schedule, one blog per week in 2013, and I didn't miss a week for over 4 years. So suddenly I had all this content.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. I mean, well, here's the secret to achievement. It's not sexy. It's consistency, right? So if you do a blog a week, I can do 500 words a week. I talk to so many people who say, I want to write a book. Well, don't write a book, write a blog. You can do a blog and then just keep doing it, sticking with it. It's the power of small wins. So anyway, that all grew into ultimately all these blog posts. And then I went back through and I started categorizing them and looking at what the categories were. And what I found was I had 3 main themes. One was connection, one was around communication, and one was around collaboration. So that became the 3 secrets to building strong leaders. And that's where the book emerged. And then on top of that, I needed to shape the context. And so the first section of the book really goes into what is the thinking or the mindset that separates out great leaders from poor ones. And a lot of it has to do with our inherited history. If you think about, so many leaders today are still living out the legacy of industrial age mentality, right? That command and control mindset. As much as we want to think that we've moved so far beyond it, so many of the practices today involve that old mindset. So that's where the book comes from.
Well, let's jump into that in a bit more detail, because that's really interesting. Was that something that you discovered? Was that a big surprise to you, or was something that you already far too familiar with?
I had a hunch around this, but then you know how a book will open your eyes and change your life? So I ended up reading a biography of Frederick Winslow Taylor, who is considered the grandfather of scientific management. If you think about it, where did organizational leadership originate? And that was a curious question to me. So turns out it was in the factory. And before that, people worked at home. And so suddenly you had these factories and you had this labor force of hundreds or thousands of people. And this had never been done before on this scale. So how are you going to organize them? How are you going to manage them? How are you going to lead them? And so they turned to mechanical engineers, of which Frederick Winslow Taylor became known as the father of scientific management. And his belief system was that workers would do anything they can to work as slowly as possible to earn their wages. So he really believed that people couldn't be trusted. And so he set up the environment where how can we command and control people? Now, we have to remember that back then, 95% of the workforce was doing repetitive manual labor. Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, famously said about his employees, "Why is it every time I want a pair of hands, they come with a brain attached?" So anyway, reading through the biography of Winslow Taylor, he would say things that literally, and I'll get the quote slightly wrong, but basically he said, the ideal worker should be so phlegmatic as to resemble the ox in their makeup as any other type. So they really didn't want people thinking. So fast forward to today, we call it the knowledge economy. So clearly trying to use the old operating system of command and control, which only worked to a point back then, but trying to enforce that and place that on top of a knowledge work age, people are not going to give you a whole lot. So to me, it was so eye-opening. And then to look at look at our language that we use in the workspace. Frankly, look at the word human resources. Yeah. Well, it comes from this mechanistic model where that humans were interdependent, these parts of the machine that can get taken out. It's like, we have a bad resource. Let's pull this human resource out and plug a new one in. And we use these mechanistic terms, like we talk about, let's drill down this message to the front lines. I have yet to meet a person who says, senior management hasn't drilled anything down into me lately. I really miss that. So you think about it, we have this language of engineering and it overtakes the language of humanity. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have engineering. I'm not saying we shouldn't have technology, but to me, it's a question of prioritizing. If we put and prioritize the people first, then the technology can support the people to deliver the results. As I like to tell a lot of people, it doesn't matter what industry you're in. Ultimately, we are all in the people business. And so having a good understanding of how people think and operate and behave really suits and it serves every single leader. So that's some of the history on that piece of it.
Love it. And that seems to be a common thing with any of the authors that I speak to is during the research phase of writing their book is the most exciting part. And you personally have a lot of growth and breakthroughs, don't you, by going through this yourself?
Yeah, and for me too is also, I'm not just writing, I'm a practitioner. So I'm out in the field with leaders every week working at this stuff. And so
Implementing it as you're writing it.
implementing and then throwing these ideas around and shaping them and getting their responses. And they're going, gosh, I never really thought about it. You know, I mean, there's this old story, you might know it. It's a parable about the holiday roast where this young woman, this young woman decides she's going to cook her family's traditional holiday roast. And so she gets out the handwritten recipe that's been passed down from generation to generation. She gets all the ingredients and then she looks at the recipe and she says, well, that's kind of weird, because the end of the recipe says you should cut the end off of the roast. She doesn't know why. So she calls up her mom and she asks her mom, and her mom says, I don't know. That's the way my mom taught me. So why don't you call up your grandmother? So she calls her grandmother. Anyway, long story short, she calls her grandma, then she calls her great grandmother, right? And asks her the same exact question. She says, great grandma, I've got the recipe. Why do you cut the end off the roast? There's this long pause, and her great grandmother says, we had a small oven. That's it. That's the reason. And that story's been around for a while, but it makes a great point, which is so many organizations suffer from small oven thinking, right? Why do we do things this way?
We always have them.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you could say, if there is a silver lining in this pandemic right now, it's that all those sacred cows are ripe for slaughter, right? We can stop. We have to press pause and question all of our assumptions. What are all the processes, the rules, the systems, the policies that we put in place? And are they actually serving us, or are they getting in the way? And so this is the opportunity for all of us to rethink, reimagine, and reinvent the future of work, which is very exciting, because in some ways, if we didn't do it ourselves, the pandemic has sort of pushed us into this situation for us.
Yeah, and that's been all of the CHROs, HR directors I've been speaking to every day over the last few weeks. Many of them are actually, like you just said, are seeing this as a huge opportunity for change, to disrupt and kind of reset and sort of build the foundation again on in a new way, which you're kind of describing right now. And so that's something, a real silver lining that's coming out of this. And there are organizations, I use my wife's as an example, I might get in trouble, but they're an organization, a finance company of 5,000 plus employees, and they're always told you can't work from home.
Right.
And despite the fact that my wife just goes into office to log into a computer, which you can do anywhere in the world, exactly. They had no choice now, right? And within the first few weeks, they went from not, no one being able to work from home to 5,000 employees working from home with a system, an internal system set up, VoIP phones for everyone. So now I'm wondering how they're going to go back. You've been saying for the last 10 years that we can't do that, it won't work. Yeah. But now you've just proved it for the last 2 to 3 months that it does. So I'm interested to see how companies have to reset after this, because they can, they're kind of they've disproven their own theories. Going through.
Completely. Yeah.
Let's go through each of the three secrets, as it were. You just told us all. Let's go through each of those one by one and kind of give us an overview of what you can expect.
Sure. Yeah. So the first secret is connection. And the idea behind connection being the foundation for effective leadership is, if you think about, at its core, leadership is not about a job title or a position. At its essence, leadership is a relationship between two people, the person who chooses to lead and the person who chooses to follow. And the quality of that relationship is dependent on the quality of connection between those two. So as I looked in my research and in my practice of, what is it that makes great leaders connect, it starts with empathy. I know we've heard a lot about the importance of empathy, particularly right now. And my easiest definition around empathy is showing people that you understand them and you care how they feel. Now, as all the listeners are hearing that, you're going, duh, I got that. It's very simple to understand. Yet what we see is, particularly in organizations, it's easier to understand than it is to apply. And in my research, I found there were 6 key themes that get in the way for us as leaders from being empathic. One really obvious one is time, that people are impatient in our busy go-to deadline, got to get this done culture. For me to actually care how you feel means I have to listen to you, Chris, and I have to take some time to set aside my own agenda. And if I'm so busy and feeling the stress and the pressure to get that done, I don't know if I really have the patience to listen to you, which means I'm not going to be empathic. So that's one of the big pieces that gets in the way. Another one is fear. The fact is, when we're talking about caring how people feel, I just saw a study just last week that 40% of employees right now in this pandemic are saying that no one has asked them at work, are you okay? It seems like that'd be the first thing for us to all
Yeah.
say, how are you feeling? How are you? Like, no one's checked in
that.
with them as a person. The sense that some people are just really uncomfortable around this feelings thing. And they think that, oh my gosh, if I ask people how they feel, that's going to open up this giant Pandora's box. You don't have to be a trained psychologist to be empathic. What you have to be is a caring human being. And the fact is, we all care for some people, whether it's our loved ones, our friends, our family. We already know what it feels like to be empathic and hold space for those people. So what we need to do as leaders is we have to expand our empathic concern circle to make it bigger and bigger, to understand that everyone we work with has a family, has a life, has an internal world that is as rich as ours. And understanding that's important. And while I know that sounds very soft and fluffy, the research has shown that feeling cared for is the number one driver of engagement and retention. And so there's all sorts of hard, good business case reasons, if you need them, for why you should care about people. You've all heard the expression, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And, if I think about what is one simple thing that people can do to become more empathic, number one thing I think you can do is listen with purpose, which is very different from just listening to finish or to give advice or to tell people what you think. Oftentimes in the HR space, we use the term, I'm holding space for people, right? We all have heard that, right? We have to hold space for our teams. As I thought about that, what holding space is really about, it means taking your own personal agenda and putting it to the side, and then being freed up to really hold space and listen to someone else's agenda fully. So listening with purpose and having a few go-to questions in advance so that you can think about what is it you want to do so you can hear people. So I've been coaching a lot of leaders over this pandemic. When you're doing your one-on-ones and your check-ins with either individuals and teams, here are some 3 questions you can ask. How are you feeling right now? And then if you need the sub prompt, you can say to yourself, shut up and listen, right? If you need that.
Yeah.
How are you feeling? Shut up and listen. What's on your mind or what's distracting you from work, right? Shut up and listen. Listen to that. And how can I support you? Or how can we support you? And it's amazing how those 3 go-to questions create a container. If you truly care about the answers, not only are you going to get great information, but the very act of you listening in that way builds stronger relationships. So empathy becomes the fast track to connection. And the easiest way to build empathy is by intentionally listening with purpose.
We need to be intentional about it and make space for it. Otherwise, all of those things, or the few points you mentioned earlier, will end up getting in the way. Because when I first became a leader, I struggled with that in the sense that sometimes I was afraid that perhaps I wouldn't have the answer. Do you think there's something common? Because that people don't want to ask how people are or how they're feeling because they may not have the answer to help them.
You bring up such a good point. And this comes back to the mindset that we carry as leaders. I think so many of us carry around this belief, I call it the superhero myth, that somehow as the leader, I'm supposed to know, I'm supposed to do well. And this comes out of our educational systems, right? If we think about what we get rewarded for, it's for having the right answer. It's not for asking good questions, So we learn, I need to know things and be aware. And we probably got very skilled. In fact, we probably got so skilled at that we got recognized, and then we get promoted into our first leadership role, which is a completely different set of skills from the individual contributor role. Yeah, stepping back and thinking, I don't need to have all the answers. What I need to do is ask questions, and then letting go of control and trusting the other people to fill in, that we're actually working with adults and helping them to fill in. Adults have this great need to be self-directed. And the more that we can open the space for them to direct themselves, the more engaged they'll be in whatever process they're a part of. Yeah.
Any examples from the interviews you did or that stand out to you?
Yeah, so I want to tell you a story about a leader. She worked for a high-end department store, and at the time that I met her, she was an executive vice president. But she told me a story about a time that she used to run the cosmetics department of one of the local stores. Early in her career, it was her first management role. So part of the prerequisites for her employees is that obviously they did lots of makeovers, because this was the cosmetics counter. So they did makeovers on customers. And so part of it was appearance. So they had to have their uniforms clean. And she had this one employee, this young woman, who, for some whatever reason, her uniform got dirty, and she noticed she'd come to work, it wasn't super clean, and she gave her a warning, and then it still didn't get clean, and then she ended up deciding, okay, I have to let her go, and she was going to have this conversation, and so she took her to the side, and she was about to basically terminate her, and there was something inside her that thought, there's something else going on here, because she did great work with the customers. She knew that something else must be going on. And so before she laid into her with like, okay, this is done, you're out of here, she basically stopped and said, hey, is there an issue with you getting your uniform clean? What's really going on? And she said it sincerely. And suddenly, it's as if though the floodgates opened. It turned out that this young woman, who at the time was about 19, had been living on her own since she was 15. So she'd been homeless basically from 15 through 19, and she was also taking care of her younger brother. And they were living in an unheated flat that didn't even have a kitchen. It was like the most bare bones thing. And what she had been doing is trying to wash her uniforms in the sink, but because of her shift, she couldn't get them all clean in time. Well, as the leader heard this story, her heart melted and realized, okay, she's a super conscientious, diligent person. Suddenly it opened up this world into what was really going on. So she said to her, would it be helpful if you had a couple of extra uniforms so you could not have to try to do this overnight hand washing in the sink and get, she said, oh my gosh. And so she did that for her. Turns out this young woman who worked the counter is now a manager within the company 10 years later. So it's just that understanding is, before we launch into our own assumption, there's always this story behind the story. And the key to empathy unlocks the meaning and the story behind the story instead of us just jumping to that conclusion. Yeah. So that was such a powerful moment for me when she told me that story.
I love that story, and I had a similar experience myself when I first became a manager. There was an employee on our sales floor. On paper, you look at the KPIs. He had the number one amount of phone calls, doing the most pitches, all off the charts. Quadruple everyone else on the floor, but no sales. And he went across probably 3 or 4 teams and just failed to achieve his targets across. And so each manager tried and failed on that, they would say. Mm-hmm. And my HR director said, look, no, we're gonna let him go, but however, do you want to see if it works out on your team? And everyone else was like, no, there's no point now, he's been here for 8 months. Right. It's not working out. But then I was looking at as I said, the KPIs, I was like, this doesn't make sense. Yeah, he's just off the charts, everything else. And so I sat down with him. I said, how are you? Like, how are you for not what's the numbers? How many deals did you get? Yeah, exactly. Kind of and I wish I could say I did that with intention. I didn't. Right. It was just sort of a gut feeling at the time. I was very young, and he was just like, oh, I'm really struggling because I moved here from Israel with my partner. We came here together, and I have no family or friends here. And his girlfriend at the time left him and went home. So he was all alone in London, could barely afford to eat. So he was coming to work just eating sort of plain pasta every day in a box, just plain pasta, no sauce, nothing, just because that's all he could afford, wearing the same suit every day. No one even noticed that. And he was just really struggling. So when he was getting to that point of the sale at the end where he had to ask for the deal, he just didn't have the courage or the energy or he just wasn't there because he was emotionally drained. Sure. So he was doing all of the work, but just sort of failing at that last hurdle. Right. Long story short, we kind of said, look, we came up with a plan together. We kind of wrote a script specifically for him, sort of help him out. Also, financially, we put some incentives in place so he can get paid a bit more in the short term to help him out. And he actually became the best sales, one of the best salesperson globally in the business. And even to this day in the company that I was working in before, he still holds all sales records in the business. And he went on to start his own company a few years after, which he sold about 2 months ago, and became a multi-millionaire himself.
That's fantastic.
And that was all within a 5-year period. We're talking like 5 years before he was in that position. 5 years later, he's a multi-millionaire. And all it took was someone just to say, how are you?
That's fantastic.
And he's one of my good friends now, and he even came to spend Christmas Day with us because he was all alone. I said, come and spend Christmas at my house with my family. And it's just small things like that just made such a big difference as well. So
that's great. That's a great story.
what about secret 2?
Secret 2, let's talk communication. Yeah, sure. So, interesting. If you look at multiple studies and you ask people, what's your biggest challenge at work? Communication almost always makes either number 1 or number 2 on the list. And it makes sense in some ways because communication is taken for granted. We think we have eyes that can see, we have mouths that can talk, fingers that can type, ears that can hear. We think if all those parts are in working order, then if communication is happening, it must be working. In some ways, we treat communication like our local electric utility power, right? We don't think about, or the internet, right? No one complains about it or thinks about it until it's not working. And by then it's like, oh, I need this. So communication is very much the same way. And what I found is that ultimately the reason that we struggle with it so much is, I'll use an analogy. So you're familiar with those carnival games where you throw a ring, it's got to go over a bottle at the ring toss? There's a really hard to get one ring.
Rattle right off.
And they rattle, and they come off, and you never win. Exactly. So if you think about it, in communication, there are 3 rings that need to all land on that bottle. And the first one is, what do I mean, right? That's the first ring. The next one is, what do I actually say or write, right? So what do I mean? What do I say? And then what do you hear, right? So those are 3 different rings. And for communication to actually happen effectively, all 3 rings need to be in alignment. And as you know, so often what people say is not what they mean. Forget even what I even hear. And so the big challenge that a lot of leaders face is they don't understand what the actual end goal is of communication. Because ultimately what we're trying to do is create shared understanding, which is I see reality the way you see it, and you see it the way I see it. And frankly, we can't ever get to 100% because I'm not you and you're not me, but we want to try to get as close to 100% as possible. And the reason that shared understanding is so important is because shared understanding becomes the platform on which we take all future action. So if it's shared and we're agreed and aligned, then we can make great decisions and get great results. If we're not aligned and we have misunderstanding or misunderstanding, then we're going to make poor decisions. We're going to get poor results. I'll just tell you like a really simple story that brings this to life. It's a personal story, but I'm sure many people can relate to this. My wife and I have a house in Massachusetts, and next to the house is a driveway that is narrow. This is all relevant to the story, by the way. It's yeah, as it will be. It's a narrow driveway. It's wide enough for 1 car that opens up to 2 cars at the end where we park our 2 cars. Now we're a 2-car family, which means that when people come to visit us, that they have to park their car behind our 2 cars, which blocks us in, which is not a big deal. We just juggle the cars around if we have to leave, which is exactly what happened on this particular weekend. So we have these friends named Pam and Charlie. Now we live in Massachusetts. They're from Washington, D.C. They drove up, they were there for the weekend, but I had to leave to go to the airport to lead a workshop. So I asked Pam if she'd move her car. And I said, could you please park your car outside? You got to move it out in front of the house. And she said, I'm sorry, you want me to move my car where? I said, oh, just park your car out in front of the house. She said, you're sure? That's what I just said, Pam. So we go back and forth with this a couple of times. And she says, finally, she says, okay, I'll park my car in front of the house. So she goes and moves her car. And I just think, what is up with Pam? I don't get what's happening. This is really weird. So I don't think anything more of it. I get my suitcase, I put it in the trunk of my car, or the boot, as you would say over here in the UK. And then I put my car in reverse and I start to back down the driveway. And as I'm backing out, my head literally shakes like this because, Pam has parked her car literally in front of the house, as in on the flowers right directly in front of the house. And I'm just thinking, this is exactly why she kept me asking, because in my mind, when I say in front of the house, what I mean is park your car on the curb in front of the house. Like where any normal person, in my mind, I'm thinking what any normal person would do, but she obviously was taking me literally. And we've all seen people do this. I mean, how many of us at work have had the experience where someone says, well, I sent the email, they should know what to do, right? Because in our minds, if I send the email, then they know exactly what needs to happen. So psychologists call this the projection bias, is where we unconsciously assume that other people have the exact same thoughts and feelings that we do. And this is just alive and well too much of the time. And so as leaders, we have to realize that misunderstanding is actually the default setting for communication. And what we need to do is insert some stopgaps, kind of updates or upgrades, hack the system so that we can actually get people on the same page. And I'll share just a couple of my favorite hacks with you. Number one, really simple. I call it asking for a receipt. So if you think about why do we have receipts? If you go to the store and buy groceries, they offer you a receipt. receipts are proof of a completed transaction. And in life, in general, if it's not a very important transaction, like if you buy a candy bar and it costs you, 50 pence, okay, fine, I don't need the receipt. But you would never dream of buying a house without getting the receipt. When it comes to communication, asking for a receipt is a way to confirm that the message that's been sent is actually what's been understood. In fact, there's a great story that comes from the fast food industry that illustrates this point. So back in the 1980s, the drive-through process in fast food was a nightmare. It was very common for people to drive up to the intercom and place their order, and then they'd go up to the window to pick up their food, and it'd be filled with mistakes. And this was consistent across the board in every restaurant for years. And then suddenly, the drive-through rates, the mistake rates just plummeted. And you might wonder, what was the new technology? It was such a simple fix. Basically, what the employees started doing, let's say I'm going to order 2 hamburgers, a cheeseburger, 3 fries, and 3 Coca-Colas. Literally, what the employees would do is they would repeat the order back to you. Okay, let me see if I got this right. 2 hamburgers, a cheeseburger, 3 fries, and 3 Cokes, right? Yes. And suddenly, boom, we have confirmation. They process the order, and you get what you wanted. Now, if you think about it, if a fast food industry will do this for a $2 hamburger, why wouldn't we do this in our meetings? How many of us have meetings where we all share the ideas and the actions that people go, and we're out of time? Okay, everyone knows what they're doing, right?
Everyone assumes it's everyone else's responsibility.
Yeah, and everyone's like, and then of course we walk out, and then we have those meetings after the meetings. We're like, oh, what did they say they're going to do? Yeah, I thought you were exactly. It's supposed to us taking the time and having that be part of our processes, that we, make sure that we confirm action steps there, because humans can miss that. So asking for a receipt is a really, really simple way to clarify what's going on. Or another really fun, easy thing to do is just whenever you begin, whether it's an in-person meeting, which those aren't happening right now, but whether it's a Zoom meeting or an email, have you stopped before you started and thought about, what's the message I want people to walk away with here? And have a message, a clear central message that is 8 words or less. To do the thinking to get it that clear. I mean, it seems so simple, but how many of us don't do it? How many of us get emails where the subject line has nothing to do with what the email is about? We all know that. And so realizing that people are drowning in information. We don't need more information. What we need is insight. And insight comes from clarity. And so for things like asking for a receipt or having a clear central message, you are working towards providing clarity. So those are just 2 examples. I think I go through about six or 7 of these in that section there. About
so simple but so effective, and everyone listening right now, I'm sure, can relate to both.
Of course, because we all struggle with it. We do. It's the nature of
right now with the in this new digital economy where everyone's working from home. I'm sure there's so much miscommunication happening, because people are sending an email or messaging on the WhatsApp in their group, or and assuming people just get it, and then they go, "Why do you mean you don't get it?"
Yeah, and also, Chris, as you're saying that, what's also happened is we don't have the casual, hey, can I just drop by if you're down the hall? I can just ask that. So suddenly, if I have a question, I have to set up a meeting, and that suddenly feels formal, and then it just changes our entire dynamic of how we work. So we need to establish channels of communication and some casualness to some of that, so people can feel free and safe enough to speak up if they're not clear on stuff. And that starts with the leader, and the leader sets the tone for that in many ways.
Amazing. All right, last but not least, step 3.
Secret 3, collaboration. Sure, yeah. So interesting thing around collaboration, because if we look at what engages people to perform at their best, what all the science has shown is that actually extrinsic rewards motivation only works in very specific situations. And in the knowledge work economy, doesn't work all that well. And so what that means is that leaders can't actually motivate anyone else. However, what that does mean is what we can do is create the environment or the conditions in which highly collaborative, motivated people are most likely to emerge. And so I borrowed this term, choice architecture, from the field of behavioral economics, because if you know choice architecture, it's this whole way that we can design things to nudge people to do certain things. So a simple example from choice architecture is, if you want to ask people, if you want them to eat smaller portions of food, serve them on smaller plates, right? Because it appears bigger, and that actually makes a big difference. It seems like it shouldn't, but it does, because that's how humans are wired. So that being said, we want to be these motivational choice architects and design environments where motivation and engagement is more likely to happen. And from my research and my practice, I found there are 4 needs that people have that need to be satisfied for them to thrive. And those needs are the need for safety, and that need is both physical safety, it's also fiscal safety, as well as psychological safety. And then that's the first need, safety. The second need is people have this need for energy. They want to be in an energized environment. So the third need is that people have a need for purpose, the sense that what they do really matters, because we all know that when you think that you're contributing something that's greater than yourself, you bring more energy to it. And the fourth need is this need for ownership, that people prefer to be self-directed, and giving them the freedom and the autonomy so that they can be self-directed, they're much more likely to be motivated and engaged in the process. So again, those 4, and again, those are the theories. And I just want to give you a couple of quick tips of things you can do to make people feel safe, and or some of the different needs: safety, energy, purpose, and ownership. So when it comes to safety, one of the most powerful things you can do as a leader is to make sure, especially on a team, is to make sure that everyone's voice is heard. All the research has shown that high-performing teams, the members have equal amounts of airtime. So if I'm not hearing from certain people, instead of just hearing from those 2 or 3 dominant people, to stop the process and draw those other people out and say, hey, Chris, we haven't heard from you on this. What are your thoughts? So we want to create that. And also realizing that some people are reflective processors. So if we expect our team just to jump in and have their answers immediately, some people might, but some people would actually do better if you gave them those questions a day in advance. So thinking about the different styles so people can feel more psychologically safe. So that's an example of safety. A simple thing that people can do around energy, I'm sure we've all had the experience of those 2 or even 3-hour meetings that just kept going on and on and on. And after about 90 minutes, you can just feel yourself just right? You're just like, oh, I can't cope. Right, but we put on our corporate face. We're like, I'm here, and you're not here.
Just your eyes are glazed over.
Yeah, and let's face it, we've all been there, and we know that's going to happen around 90 minutes. So I call it the 90-minute rule. So make sure that you insert a break before 90 minutes comes, and give people a chance to renew and refresh. Because again, this goes back to our industrial age conversation. We are not designed like machines. We can't work 24 hours a day and just nonstop continuously. Another simple thing to do around energy is, right now, I'm sure many people, we talk about Zoom fatigue, but this comes back to schedule fatigue. How many of us have a 9 o'clock meeting that goes exactly until 10, and then the 10 o'clock meeting has started? That has left absolutely zero time.
I did that in the first few weeks, and it was bad.
Yeah, so you need buffer, right?
Yeah.
So a 45 or a 50 or 55-minute meeting. So again, factoring the humanity into this. All this stuff works well on paper if you're an engineer, does not work so well as a human. And so whether it's safety or energy or ownership or purpose, there's so many tools and tips that are there to help you to become a more effective leader, because by you creating that environment, other people can suddenly thrive.
Amazing.
So that's a bit on collaboration.
Well, thanks so much. It's been I feel like we need another hour to go.
Again, yeah.
We'll do part 2 for everyone. If we get enough requests, we'll do part 2.
Yeah. Well, it is. I mean, the book is 22 years of practice trying to distill down. So there's a lot in there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to join me on the show. For everyone listening, if there's sort of one parting piece of advice, what would that be? And then where's the best place they can grab a copy of the book and check out more about your work?
Sure. So the parting wisdom, if I look at the themes around connection, communication, and collaboration, overarching all of them is, at the end of the day, leadership isn't about you, it's about them. So if you can have the framework of what can I do to support people through my connection, through my collaboration, through my communication, I'm going to be in better shape. So just always framing it from how can I serve and how can I help? It's going to make you a better leader. So that's the parting piece on that. In terms of finding out more about me and the book, easiest place to go is to the book website, which is www.crackingtheleadershipcode.com, spelled the way it sounds. And if you go there, you'll learn all about the book. You can actually download the first chapter to preview the book there. And that will link you directly to my alainhunkins.com website. And you can then navigate around and learn around the different services that I offer. I do coaching and consulting, speaking and training, both live and now obviously online. and now virtually, especially. And so feel free to contact me there. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn, and anything I can do to support you and your teams in leadership, I'm here to help. Thanks.
Yeah, and also make sure you connect with Alan on LinkedIn as well, right? You're
exactly
on LinkedIn as well. So
yeah,
thanks again for taking the time to join. It's been a real pleasure. I'm so happy we managed to make this happen. For everyone listening at home, thank you for joining us. If you're listening on the podcast or LinkedIn Line, we appreciate you all taking the time out to join us. As always, if you enjoyed the episode, please like, comment, share. We want to make sure we spread this knowledge with as many people as possible to help them, especially given the times that we're going through right now as well. So please hit share, tag in a colleague, tag in a friend that you feel will gain value. Apart from that, I'll let you go, Alan. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Okay.
Oh, Chris, it's been a super pleasure. Thank you so much.
See ya. Bye.
Thanks.